My name is Chris Gaal. I'm the Monroe County Prosecutor, and I'd like to thank, again, the members of the committee for your interest in this issue. My office, Monroe County, is the hub county that oversees APS Unit 10, which provides service in Morgan, Monroe, and Owen counties. This slide is relevant to what we were just talking about. These are statistics from 2013 that show the breakdown in what our APS system in Indiana did during that year. The total calls for service, you'll notice, nearly 40,000. Cases investigated, over 10,000. That's for 92 counties in Indiana, handled by only 27.5 investigators for the state of Indiana and 17 directors of each of the hubs. These numbers tell the story of APS in a nutshell. APS is overworked, understaffed, and underfunded. The slide also lists substantiated and unsubstantiated cases. You may notice, if you look closely, that the total of the substantiated plus the unsubstantiated cases is actually less than the 10,000 figure. And that reflects the fact that at the time that this data was collected, not all of the investigations were concluded. And in addition to that, not all the data was entered into the system. And again, this goes back to the understaffing issue. There are data entry backlogs that result from an overwhelming caseload and not enough people to do that data entry. And in a minute, I'll talk about the fact that several hubs have actually had to eliminate data entry positions in their offices due to budget constraints in order to retain the investigators that they have. The next slide, Suzanne, talks about how these various types of allegations break down, and you'll see the figures there for this is the 10,000 cases breaking down into abuse, 2,525, neglect, 2,794, exploitation, 1,564, and self-neglect, 3,164. Again, if you total these up, the total number of allegations is more than the 10,000 because you can have more than one type of allegation per case. And I think the really important and interesting thing to note about these categories is that the biggest category here that we handle is self-neglect. That means that an adult is incapable of managing their own self-care. It's not the result of someone else doing something bad to them. It's not a crime that we're talking about. It means that they're on their own, they can't take care of themselves, and they have no one else to help them, no friends or family members available. In those situations, APS gets a call. Our investigators go out and they do what they do best. They investigate. And what they often find is disturbing and even heartbreaking. An elderly person living in squalor, often undernourished, sometimes with serious health issues, body sores, bed bugs, trash, personal filth piled up around them. That's what we mean by self-neglect. There's often a prior history of medical treatment, including trips to the hospital. Then the person's ultimately discharged to go live back at their home. They're on their own. Their condition deteriorates again, this time even worse. And ultimately, it reaches a point where there's a clear need for some type of intervention, some type of case management supervision or in-home assistance or placement into a residential facility. APS documents those findings in its investigation. And then they begin the process to find appropriate services to address that issue, or if necessary, a placement into an appropriate facility, which often involves taking some type of legal action. And in cases of self-neglect, we're not talking about criminal charges. We're talking about civil remedies, such as filing a petition for guardianship or getting an order of protection from the court or an order for emergency services. Some of the advantages of our model of housing APS in the prosecutor's office are that we know how to do investigations and document the facts that support these various types of allegations so that they can then later be established in court. And then APS, because it's in the prosecutor's office, has access to lawyers who are in court every day, who know the system, know how things work, that can then assist them with pursuing remedies like guardianships or orders for emergency services to address the risks of harm. So frankly, that legal assistance and that support from elsewhere in the prosecutor's office is one of the reasons that our APS system in Indiana has been able to limp along for so many years, understaffed and underfunded. That access to lawyers in the prosecutor's office has been an advantage for APS, but it's also allowed us to put the funding issues on the back burner and not deal with it. Next slide, please. These are the age of victims, and as you're probably not surprised to see, the majority were age 60 and older, as you might expect, but almost half were between the ages of 18 and 59 years of age. Why is that? Again, it reflects the fact that a large part of what we deal with in our APS system and the cases that we handle have to do with developmentally disabled adults or severely mentally ill adults. It's not just the elderly when we're talking about APS. The next slide has to do with the APS budget. This is a chart that shows the amount of money budgeted to APS over the last 10 years from state fiscal year 2005-06 to 2016 and 17. And what I'd like for you to notice about this slide is that the funding level has remained relatively flat during that entire period. Over 10 years, the APS appropriation has increased by $430,408. And while FSSA has found additional money within their budget to supplement the total grant amount, it's still not been enough. In 2011, FSSA increased the APS grant with federal SSBG funds, and they continue to do so. But prosecutors have also had to ask local county councils for funding to keep the APS operating. So, for example, in 2011, local county governments subsidized the APS program with an additional $479,000. And prosecutors and local governments also provide other types of in-kind contributions to support APS in the form of telephones, computers, office space, management of staff, administrative support, payroll, benefits, hiring, management of staff, those sorts of things. In Monroe County, we actually use our county general fund budget to pay for part-time staff in APS to answer the phone and to do data entry, and that's one way that we've been able to keep up with our data entry in our unit. As of July 1st of this year, FSSA increased APS funding by $430,000 from the FSSA budget, and again, while that's helpful, it still hasn't been enough to hire additional staff in most hubs. If you go to the next slide, please, Suzanne. No, I want to address the next slide. Given the current level of funding in APS, something had to give. And as mentioned before, many of the hub prosecutors have actually subsidized APS through their own budgets or with county appropriations. The problem there is that APS hubs serve multiple counties, and county councils in the hub prosecutor's county, as you might expect, are generally reluctant to provide money for services that are provided in other counties. And also what's happened to resolve budget shortfalls is that prosecutors have actually had to reduce staff, and when the problem is that we're already understaffed to deal with our existing demand for services, that's going in the wrong direction. What this slide shows is that 4 hubs had to cut investigator hours. There were 3 full-time investigator positions that were actually reduced to part-time positions. We had 1 hub reduce investigator salaries, and we had 5 hubs eliminate the data entry positions in order to retain their investigators. So that's the loss of data entry people that I referred to at the beginning that makes it more difficult for us to have accurate data that we need. Other issues that we've dealt with of this nature are staff turnover. We've had a lot of staff turnover during the last 5 years. 11 out of 13 hubs had to fill, out of 18 hubs had to fill positions. 8 hubs had to fill the same position more than once during that 5-year period, and typically what happens is that people leave for better paying jobs. So APS has wound up relying more on part-time personnel. The next slide, problems in the system. These are the main problems that we see, that we believe need to be addressed. I'm going to give you just a summary of those problems, and then we're going to have slides on more specifically on each of those and discuss them in more depth. But I do want to highlight the issues and say a few words from my perspective as a hub prosecutor about each of these. Number one, insufficient APS staff. I gave you those stats from 2013, and that really describes the problem. 40,000 reports, 10,000 investigated cases, 92 counties in the state of Indiana, 27.5 investigators to handle that caseload. That really in itself tells the story. There are simply not enough investigators to handle that workload and give those cases the full attention that they deserve. Things are going to slip through the cracks, and we cannot continue under that level of pressure and expect the APS system to function adequately. What it comes down to is we need more boots on the ground, more investigators, not just answering the phone, but going out into the field and conducting home visits, spending time on the road, traveling to the various counties in their jurisdictions, in their service area, following up on those reports by doing a thorough investigation, documenting the facts, and then taking the appropriate legal action or making the appropriate referral for services. With regard to lack of placement and services, again, APS doesn't provide in-home care. We don't run assisted living facilities or nursing homes or group homes. We don't do any of that. APS does investigations. We gather the facts, we document the problem, and then we get on the phone and try and figure out a solution to the problem. We figure out where we can send this person to get them the help that they need, or if we need to take legal action to solve the problem, we file the necessary paperwork in court and we get that ball rolling. Again, that's an advantage to our system of affiliating APS with the prosecutor's office, because prosecutors know how to do investigations. We know how to get the ball rolling to make something happen. Prosecutors are problem solvers. That's what we do all the time in the cases that go to court, and many of the ones that never make it that far because they get solved prior to ever getting to court. We now work in problem-solving courts, drug courts, mental health courts. So we're problem solvers. But the fact is that even when we investigate and we document the problem and we take action, we can't address the problems that we encounter in APS if the solution doesn't exist. If we encounter a person in a crisis situation who's in need of emergency placement or services, and those options are simply not available, then in effect, there are no solutions available. And in our experience, BEADS, the Bureau of Developmental Disability Service, currently does not have adequate funding for emergency placements. So think of an example. There's the example of a developmentally disabled man. He's in his 40s. He's always lived with his mother who's taking care of him. Mother dies. There's no other family member or friend to step in and help out. APS can get a call, go out, investigate, document that problem, identify that need, make the referral. But the reality currently in Indiana is that there is nowhere for that developmentally disabled 40-year-old man to go for an emergency placement. He's put on a list. It may be months. It may be years before a placement becomes available. He may wind up in a homeless shelter. That's not an appropriate response to that problem. The availability of placements and services is a missing piece of the puzzle that I want to make sure this committee is aware of that needs to be addressed. The lack of uniformity. I want to make sure that members of the committee understand that we have good people in APS who really care about their work, who are trying to do a good job, doing the best job they possibly can. But when there is an overwhelming caseload and inadequate staffing levels and high turnover, something's got to give. Things will fall through the cracks. We have not had a consistent uniform APS system in Indiana. Instead, we've had several APS units doing the best they can in each jurisdiction, pretty much on their own. And we've kept that system functioning. But we can do better, and we have to do better, because the needs are only going to increase with our aging population. And a good example of the uniformity problem is guardianships. Indiana had a guardianship state task force that determined that we had a need for a greater number of people to serve as guardians to help protect indigent adults who lack the capacity to manage their own affairs because of dementia or stroke or some other developmental disability or some problem. And the Indiana Supreme Court made that a priority, and with the help of the legislature was able to provide funding through the Judicial Center for a grant program to set up for communities to set up voluntary guardianship programs throughout the state and start to address that need of providing the service of guardians. We've identified guardians, the need for guardians, as a serious issue in our state, and we've begun to address that. But in order to meet that need, you not only have to have people willing and able to serve as guardians, you have to have somebody ready to step in and file that petition for guardianship under the appropriate circumstances and get the ball rolling in the legal process. And right now, only about half the APS units will file a petition for guardianship because they don't have the resources to do the investigations and then everything else that's needed. And in some places, guardianship petitions are one of the things that are not happening. And right now, in Unit 10, my unit, our APS will file a petition for guardianship, but we don't have sufficient guardians available in our community. So we're working on that. We've applied for funding through this grant program. We're working to to set up a volunteer guardianship program, working very closely with our AAA, our Area Agency on Aging. And hopefully we will soon both have an APS unit that files guardianship petitions and a volunteer guardian program to provide those guardians. The uniformity issue goes back ultimately to funding. If the APS staff is adequately staffed, if APS is adequately staffed and funded, we can move forward toward uniformity in providing the services that are needed to make sure that a guardianship petition is filed when no one else is available to step in and help, no friends or family. I want to be clear that prosecutors and APS hub directors are currently working with state APS, the Division of Aging, FSSA, to develop a standard operating procedures manual for all the APS units. Prosecutors support that concept, and we recognize that greater uniformity of procedures is a real need and should be a goal for APS. But it also has to be recognized that without adequate funding for additional staff, we cannot realistically move forward with imposing additional responsibilities, duties, and requirements for the provision of services in all our APS units, given the existing inadequate level of resources that we currently have available. That is not realistic. These investigators already have their hands full, and what they need is an extra set of hands on deck. So we're ready to work toward greater uniformity of services, but it has to be more than just uniform rules on a piece of paper. We need the resources that are necessary in order to make the uniform services a reality. The final point that I wish to address is the no built-in potential for growth. The elderly population is increasing. It's a higher percentage of our population. The so-called silver tsunami is approaching, and we have to be ready for that future. Unfortunately, we're not ready to deal with our existing needs. We have to get our house in order so that we can be ready for the future, because those needs are only going to increase, and we've not kept pace. These are our most vulnerable citizens. We have to be concerned with their security and dignity and safety. These are our family and friends. These are our neighbors, and ultimately ourselves, because we're all getting older, and We'll all be there someday, hopefully. And we have to think about growing the capacity of APS to meet the needs of the future that we know are coming. Thank you.
Just a couple questions.